Leave a comment with your city name and subscribe to HFY Tales by JB.
Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden identity and legendary reputation, drop a quick hi in the comments. It helps YouTube share these stories with more sci-fi fans like us. And trust me, you're going to want everyone to see what happens when the most feared name in the galaxy is spoken by someone who appears to be nobody special. The cargo hold of the Zephyrian transport ship Harvester reeked of fear, sweat, and despair. 300 human beings sat chained to the metal floor in rows of 10, their faces bearing the hollow expression of people who had lost everything and now faced a future that promised only suffering. The ship's massive engines thrummed through the hull as it carried its human cargo toward the slave markets of Nexus Station, where sentient beings were bought and sold like livestock to the highest bidder. The Zephyrian Empire had been conducting these harvest operations for 6 months now, raiding human colonies and taking anyone who might prove useful as forced labor. In row 27, seat 4, sat a man who looked utterly unremarkable among the sea of captured humanity. John Smith appeared to be in his mid-40s, with graying brown hair, average height, and the kind of face that would disappear in any crowd. His clothes were simple work coveralls bearing the logo of Colony 7's maintenance division, and his hands showed the calluses that came from years of manual labor. Or so it appeared. While the other prisoners wept, prayed, or stared into space with the vacant expressions of the traumatized, John sat quietly and observed everything. His eyes tracked the guard rotations with professional interest. He noted the ship's internal structure, the security protocols, the weapons carried by their captors. When other prisoners tried to engage him in conversation, he responded with simple, unremarkable answers that discouraged further interaction. "Name's John Smith," he would say in a flat, tired voice. "Maintenance worker from Colony 7. Don't know much about anything except fixing pipes and cleaning filters." But Dr. Sarah Kim, an astrophysicist who had been captured during the raid on the research station at Kepler 9, noticed something that the others missed. Despite John's apparent resignation, his eyes held an alertness that suggested a mind still actively engaged. More than once, she caught him making subtle hand gestures that looked suspiciously like military reconnaissance signals. "You're not what you seem, are you?" she whispered during one of their brief rest periods. John's response was perfectly calibrated to deflect suspicion. "Don't know what you mean, ma'am. I'm just a worker who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." Dr. Kim might have pressed further, but at that moment, the ship's intercom crackled to life with the harsh voice of Commander Zektal, the Zephyrian officer in charge of the transport. "Attention, human cargo," the translated voice announced with casual contempt. "We will arrive at Nexus Station in 12 hours. You will be processed for sale according to your market value. Scientists and engineers will go to premium buyers. Military personnel will be sold to combat arenas. The rest of you..." The alien's laughter was like breaking glass. "Well, the rest of you will learn what it means to work until you die." A ripple of fresh despair moved through the cargo hold. Parents clutched their children. Spouses held each other and whispered final words of love. Soldiers who had survived the colony raids clenched their fists in futile rage. John Smith continued to sit quietly, but Dr. Kim noticed that his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, something had flickered in his eyes, not fear or despair, but cold, calculating anger. The processing began as soon as the harvester docked at Nexus Station. The massive orbital facility was a monument to the galaxy's darkest commerce, where beings from dozens of species came to buy and sell sentient labor. Its corridors echoed with the cries of the enslaved and the laughter of their purchasers. Human prisoners were herded through medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and skills assessments that would determine their market value. Dr. Kim found herself classified as premium scientific personnel and tagged for sale to the highest bidder. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Torres, who had been captured defending the military outpost on Kepler 9, was marked for the gladiatorial arenas where former soldiers fought to the death for alien entertainment. When John Smith's turn came, the evaluation was perfunctory. The Zephyrian clerk barely looked up from his data pad as he asked the standard questions. Species designation? Human. Name? John Smith. Occupation? Maintenance worker. Special skills or training? None. Education level? Basic technical certification. Family or associates who might pay ransom? None. The clerk marked John's file as low-value labor stock and moved on to the next prisoner. In less than 5 minutes, John had been categorized as completely disposable, exactly what he had intended. But standing in the shadow of a loading crane, someone had been watching the evaluation process with more interest than the board clerk. Vexmore, lieutenant to the crime lord Thane Corthake, specialized in finding hidden value among the supposedly worthless. Something about the maintenance worker from Colony 7 had caught his attention. It wasn't anything obvious. John had played his role perfectly. But Vexmore had spent decades in the slavery business, and he had developed an instinct for spotting people who were more than they appeared. The human's posture was wrong for a manual laborer. His eyes moved with the tactical awareness of someone trained in combat. Most tellingly, he had shown no surprise or confusion at the alien technology and procedures around him. Thane Corthake arrived at the auction 3 hours later, his massive form cutting through the crowd like a predator among scavengers. The crime lord specialized in dangerous mining operations where human life was cheap and worker mortality was considered an acceptable business expense. He typically bought in bulk, focusing on quantity over quality. The usual selection, he told Vexmore as they surveyed the available humans. 50 units, lowest price bracket. I need bodies for the deep shafts on Keth 7. Vexmore nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on John Smith, who sat with the other low-value prisoners awaiting sale. What about that one? The maintenance worker? Corthake barely glanced at John. Unremarkable. Why do you ask? Something feels wrong about him. His psychological profile doesn't match his background. Explain. Vexmore had learned to trust his instincts over the years. He's too calm. Too observant. Look at how he positions himself: maximum visibility of exits, minimum exposure to potential threats. That's tactical thinking, not the behavior of a frightened civilian. Corthake studied John more carefully, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh lighting of the auction floor. After a moment, he nodded slowly. Include him in the purchase. But keep him isolated during transport. If your suspicions are correct, I want to know who we're really dealing with. The journey to Keth 7 took 18 hours, during which John found himself separated from the other prisoners and placed in a private cell aboard Corthake's personal transport. The isolation was clearly intended to increase psychological pressure, but John used the time to continue his reconnaissance. Through the small viewport, he observed the approach to the mining asteroid, noting defensive positions and docking procedures. Keth 7 was a nightmare of industrial brutality. The asteroid had been hollowed out over decades of mining operations, its interior a maze of tunnels, processing plants, and worker barracks. The atmosphere was barely breathable, kept at minimum standards to preserve worker productivity. Life expectancy for human laborers was measured in months, and worker replacement was considered routine overhead. John was assigned to Deep Shaft 7, the most dangerous area of the mining operation. The work involved extracting rare crystals from unstable rock formations using primitive tools and minimal safety equipment. A single mistake could trigger a cave-in that would kill dozens of workers, but the Zephyrians considered such losses acceptable as long as production quotas were met. For the first week, John played his role perfectly. He worked his assigned shifts, kept his head down, and spoke only when spoken to. But Vexmore was watching, and his suspicions continued to grow. The first anomaly came during a routine equipment briefing. The shift supervisor was explaining the operation of a crystal extraction device when John's expression briefly shifted from vacant compliance to professional assessment. The change lasted less than a second, but Vexmore caught it. Later that day, Vexmore conducted a test. He approached John with a data pad displaying technical schematics and claimed it showed the mining equipment they would be using. "Can you understand any of this, human?" he asked, watching John's face carefully. John glanced at the display and immediately recognized it as a schematic for a Zephyrian battle cruiser's primary weapon system. His eyes automatically tracked the power flow diagrams and targeting arrays before he caught himself. "Sorry, sir," he said in his carefully maintained monotone. "Can't read alien writing. Just tell me what needs fixing." But Vexmore had seen the momentary flash of expertise. This maintenance worker had not only understood the schematic, he had analyzed it with the practiced eye of someone familiar with advanced military technology. The investigation began in earnest the following day. Vexmore started with John's official records, but they were exactly what they appeared to be: documentation for an unremarkable maintenance worker from a remote mining colony. Birth certificate, education records, employment history, medical files, everything was present and properly authenticated. Too properly authenticated. Vexmore had processed thousands of human prisoners, and their documentation was typically incomplete, damaged, or inconsistent. But John Smith's records were perfect, too perfect for someone from a frontier colony with limited administrative resources. The psychological profile was equally suspicious. John showed none of the trauma responses typical of recently enslaved humans. He wasn't suffering from depression, anxiety, or the desperate hope for rescue that characterized most prisoners. Instead, he displayed the patient composure of someone following a long-term plan. More telling were the small behavioral details that John couldn't completely suppress. His unconscious awareness of guard rotations. The way he positioned himself to maintain tactical advantage in any room. His instinctive understanding of the facility's security protocols. These weren't the traits of a maintenance worker, they were the reflexes of someone with extensive military training. Vexmore decided to increase the pressure. The emergency was carefully staged to test John's true capabilities. Vexmore triggered a false alarm indicating a reactor breach in Deep Shaft 7, then watched through security cameras as the workers responded to the crisis. Most of the humans panicked, running in confusion as sirens wailed and emergency lights flashed. But John immediately moved toward the control panel with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what to do. His hands moved over the alien controls with practiced efficiency, and he had begun implementing emergency shutdown procedures before catching himself and stepping back. "Too late," Vexmore murmured to himself. "I saw you." The systematic interrogation began the next day. John was removed from the general population and placed in an isolation cell where Vexmore could apply pressure without interference. The lieutenant was skilled in psychological manipulation, and he used every technique in his arsenal. Sleep deprivation, sensory overload, calculated threats against fellow prisoners. Vexmore worked methodically to break down John's resistance, searching for cracks in his carefully maintained facade. But John endured it all with the patience of someone who had been trained to resist interrogation. He gave no useful information, showed no signs of breaking, and maintained his cover story despite hours of relentless questioning. "Who are you really?" Vexmore demanded during one particularly intense session. "No maintenance worker has your training or your resistance to interrogation techniques. What are you hiding?" John's response was the same as always. "I'm just a worker who got caught up in something bigger than me. I don't know anything worth knowing." But his eyes told a different story. Behind the facade of humble compliance, Vexmore could see the calculating intelligence of someone who was several moves ahead of his captors. The breakthrough came during the third week of John's captivity, when Vexmore made his final gambit. He had Dr. Sarah Kim brought to the interrogation chamber, where she was restrained and threatened with torture. "Tell me your real identity," Vexmore demanded, "or I will make this female suffer for your deception." For the first time since his capture, John showed genuine emotion. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists, and something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "She's innocent," he said quietly. "A scientist who was just doing her job. Leave her alone. Then tell me the truth. Who are you really?" John looked at Dr. Kim, who was watching him with growing understanding. She had suspected from the beginning that he wasn't what he seemed, and now she could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. He was weighing his mission against her safety. his cover identity against her life. The intelligence he was protecting against the moral imperative to save an innocent person. "I'm waiting," Bexmore said, activating a neural disruptor that would cause excruciating pain. "Last chance before I demonstrate what happens to humans who waste my time." John straightened in his restraints, and for the first time in weeks, he stood at full military attention. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of high command. "My name is Admiral Jonathan Marcus Smith, Supreme Commander of the Earth Defense Force." The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Every Zephyrian in the room went completely still, their compound eyes widening with shock and terror. The neural disruptor fell from Bexmore's suddenly nerveless fingers. Dr. Kim gasped, finally understanding why John had seemed so familiar. She had seen his face in news broadcasts, military documentaries, and historical archives. Admiral Smith was legend, the tactical genius who had turned humanity's desperate defense into a crushing counteroffensive, the ghost who had vanished after the Battle of Proxima, the most wanted human in Zephyrian space. "Impossible," Bexmore whispered. "Admiral Smith died at Proxima. The entire Zephyrian fleet confirmed his ship's destruction." John's smile was cold as winter space. "Did they? Or did they see exactly what I wanted them to see?" The implications crashed over Bexmore like a tidal wave. If Admiral Smith was alive, if he had been captured and was sitting in their interrogation chamber, then everything changed. The bounty on his head was worth more than entire star systems. His strategic knowledge could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. His public execution would be the greatest propaganda victory in Zephyrian history. But more immediately terrifying was the question of why the most dangerous human in known space had allowed himself to be captured. "Alert Thane Korthake immediately," Bexmore commanded the guards, who were still staring at John in shock. "Then contact the Zephyrian High Command. Tell them we have Admiral Smith." "Already done," came Korthake's voice from the chamber's communication system. The crime lord had been monitoring the interrogation remotely. "I've been in contact with Emperor Zekthal himself. A fleet is being assembled to transport our prize to the capital for public execution." John nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. "How long until they arrive?" The question was so casual, so lacking in fear or desperation, that it made Bexmore's skin crawl. 18 hours, Korthake replied automatically, then caught himself. "Why do you ask?" "Just making sure my timing is correct." "Your timing for what?" John's smile widened. "For the rescue." Before anyone could respond to this apparent delusion, alarms began wailing throughout the facility. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red as automated systems detected massive energy signatures at the edge of the asteroid field. But the most significant victory was psychological. Throughout the galaxy, the story spread of the human admiral who had endured months of slavery to gather the intelligence needed to free thousands of his people. John's willingness to sacrifice his safety for others became legend, inspiring resistance movements and striking fear into the hearts of those who trafficked in sentient beings. Dr. Sarah Kim, now serving as chief xenobiologist aboard the ES Retribution, found John standing at an observation window watching the stars stream past as they returned to human space. "Any regrets?" she asked. John considered the question seriously. "About the mission?" "No." "About the cost?" "Every day." "What cost?" "The people we couldn't save in time. The prisoners who died in facilities I couldn't reach. The intelligence that had to be protected even when lives hung in the balance." Dr. Kim studied his profile, noting the weight that command had etched into his features. "You saved thousands of people, Admiral. Your sacrifice made that possible. And thousands more died while I was gathering the intelligence to make it possible. Command is about living with those calculations, Doctor. About accepting that sometimes the greatest kindness is delayed justice. Is that why you revealed your identity? To save me from torture?" John's smile was tired but genuine. "No, Doctor. I revealed my identity because my mission was complete and the cost of maintaining cover had become greater than the benefit. The timing was always planned to coincide with the rescue operation. So my capture was just convenient timing? Your capture was the excuse I needed to break cover at the optimal moment. But make no mistake, I would never have let them hurt you, mission or no mission. 5 years after the Keth-7 liberation, Admiral Jonathan Marcus Smith stood before the Galactic Council presenting humanity's formal proposal for the Universal Sentient Rights Accords. The legislation would establish legal protections for all intelligent beings and create enforcement mechanisms to prevent the kind of systematic slavery that had once plagued human space. The proposal was co-sponsored by 17 different species, including former enemies who had been persuaded by humanity's demonstration that moral authority backed by military capability could reshape galactic civilization. The choice before us is simple, John told the assembled delegates. We can continue to tolerate systems that treat sentient beings as property, or we can establish principles that recognize the inherent dignity of all intelligent life. Emperor Zekthal, now considerably aged and politically weakened by the liberation campaigns, rose to address the council. The Zephyrian Empire supports the human proposal, he announced, drawing gasps from delegates who remembered when his people had been among the galaxy's most prolific slave traders. Recent events have demonstrated that civilizations which fail to respect the rights of others inevitably face consequences they cannot anticipate or control. The vote was unanimous. Later that evening, at a reception celebrating the Accord's passage, Dr. Kim approached John with a question that had been troubling her for years. Admiral, do you think they would have passed this legislation if you hadn't sacrificed yourself to gather intelligence on the slave networks? John considered the question while watching delegates from dozens of species celebrating together former enemies now united by shared principles. I think moral progress requires more than good intentions, Doctor. It requires the capability to enforce principles and the willingness to pay the cost of doing so. And was the cost worth it? John gestured toward a group of former slaves who were now serving as advocates for sentient rights, their experiences giving them unique authority to speak about the importance of freedom. Every person in this room who might have ended up in chains if we hadn't acted? Every child who will grow up free because we established these protections? Every species that will now think twice before engaging in the slave trade? He paused, weighing the mathematics of sacrifice and salvation that defined his career. Yes, Doctor. It was worth it. As the evening continued, John found himself in conversation with Vexmore, the former Zephyrian lieutenant who had investigated his identity at Keth-7. The alien had become an advocate for prisoner rights after witnessing the systematic abuses of the slave trade. I still don't understand how you endured it, Vexmore said. Months of captivity, weeks of interrogation, the constant threat of discovery. How did you maintain your sanity? John's answer was simple but profound. I remembered why I was there. Every moment of suffering had purpose. Every risk was calculated against potential salvation for others. When you know that your endurance serves a greater cause, you find strength you didn't know you possessed. And if the mission had failed? If your identity had been discovered too early? Then I would have died knowing that I had tried to make a difference. Sometimes that's all any of us can do, ensure that our sacrifice serves something greater than ourselves. Vexmore nodded slowly, understanding finally why his investigation had never broken the humans' resistance. John hadn't been protecting just his identity, he had been protecting hope itself. The evening wound down with toasts and speeches celebrating the new era of universal rights. But for John, the most meaningful moment came when Admiral Chen pulled him aside for a private conversation. The Council wants to promote you, she said. Supreme Commander of Galactic Defense Forces. The position would give you authority to enforce the new accords across all member species. John shook his head. I'm honored, but I think my time in uniform is ending. There are other ways to serve. Such as? Education. Making sure future leaders understand that true strength comes from protecting others, not exploiting them. That the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is moral authority backed by the willingness to sacrifice for principles. Chen studied his face, noting the peace that had settled over features once marked by the weight of impossible decisions. You've earned the rest, Admiral. But the galaxy will miss your leadership. The galaxy doesn't need my leadership anymore, John replied. It needs the principles we've established and the institutions to protect them. That's a legacy that will outlast any individual. As the reception ended and delegates departed for their homeworlds, John stood alone on the observation deck watching the stars that had once seemed filled with threats and now appeared bright with possibility. Dr. Kim joined him one final time, carrying 2 glasses of wine and a question that had been building throughout the evening. Admiral, was John Smith really your name? Or was that part of the cover identity? John accepted the wine with a smile that held both amusement and melancholy. That's the beautiful irony, Doctor. John Smith really is my name. The most ordinary name in human space, carried by someone who ended up in extraordinary circumstances. So the legend of Admiral Smith started with someone actually named Smith? Sometimes the most unlikely people end up changing the galaxy. Names don't make legends, choices do. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars and contemplating the strange paths that had brought them to this moment of triumph. The human prisoner who had said his name and made aliens' faces go white with terror had become something more than a military commander. He had become proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to sacrifice for others rather than protect themselves. And throughout the galaxy, in 1,000 different languages, beings who had once been enslaved would tell their children the story of Admiral John Smith, the man with the most common name in human space who had done the most uncommon thing of all. He had chosen to suffer so that others might be free. And that, my friends, is how one man's name became more powerful than any weapon, more terrifying than any fleet, and more inspiring than any speech. When Admiral Jonathan Marcus Smith revealed his identity, he didn't just frighten his captors, he reminded the galaxy that true power comes from those willing to sacrifice everything for the freedom of others. What did you think of John's months-long deception and the liberation it made possible? The way an ordinary name carried by an extraordinary person became a symbol of hope across the galaxy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing how these stories of sacrifice and justice resonate with fellow sci-fi fans. If you enjoyed this epic tale of how hidden identity and moral courage can reshape entire civilizations, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed for more stories that explore what it truly means to lead by example and serve something greater than yourself. And check out the next video I've chosen for you, another tale of humanity proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the willingness to endure any cost for the sake of others. Until next time, remember, in a universe full of names and titles, the most powerful identity is the one that stands for justice, no matter the personal cost.